She grew up with an alcoholic. She has a very different Richter scale than her husband because of how she grew up. If you grew up in an environment where you were beaten, you're going to tolerate a lot more than someone who is used to being treated with respect and kindness.
Yes, okay, they can be your hero, but also understand that they just got that pedestal because they're your father or they're your mom. Like, they're also a person who has flaws, who is imperfect, who hasn't worked on themselves.
Conscious couples, business partners, and singles committed to attracting their dream partner. Welcome to the Conscious Couples podcast, where we share our life, love story, and combined relationship expertise to help you create and consistently cultivate the most magnificent, intimate relationship possible.
Never again will you feel hopeless and alone in your intimate relationship challenges.
Having accumulated thousands of hours coaching conscious couples and individuals all over the world, as well as starting and growing a global business together, Alan and I are here to guide you in all things relationships.
Thank you again for tuning into the one place where it's not about you or me, it's about the we. Conscious couples and singles, welcome back to another episode of the one and only Conscious Couples podcast. For today, we have episode 158. How different are you and your partner's Richter scales? We're going to get into that. Hang tight. Before we jump into this episode, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Next Level Podcast Solutions. So Kevin and I spoke, and we work with 69 podcasters now. It's actually more than that because some of the podcasts that we produce, similar to yours, sweetheart, have two hosts. So we calculated it between the business owners and the podcasters that we work with. It's over 100 clients.
It's amazing.
So Next Level Podcast Solutions, thank you so much for all that you do. Personal growth, personal development, self-improvement, mental health, spreading all these wonderful things into the world. Also a couple clients that do fitness and peak performance and all that kind of stuff as well. So if you want to start, grow, scale, or monetize a podcast, we've been pretty much learning about podcasting every single day for the last 8 years. We will help you. Please reach out. My love, as always, ladies first, what is your intention for today's episode?
My intention for today's episode for listeners is to help them understand what is a Richter scale, what is a Richter scale as it applies to their preferred level of treatment in a relationship, and how they might be showing up in their relationship and either pinging on their partner's Richter scale or unconsciously destroying the Richter scale. So, the Richter scale. Here we go. We actually mentioned that we were going to do this episode 2 episodes ago. So, if you're listening to this one and you want a little bit of pre-context, 2 episodes ago, we talked about all the things that lay the groundwork for this episode.
All right. So, in that other episode, we talked about if you were born in California, there's a lot of earthquakes in Cali, apparently.
In statistical comparison to other states.
Yes. So imagine in this metaphor that you grew up with earthquakes on the reg. 50 a year. Again, making these numbers up, 50 a year. And your partner grew up in Massachusetts where pretty much no earthquakes. The occasional one, apparently we had one 2 years ago or a year ago or something. I didn't even feel it because it was barely on the Richter scale. So that's a good metaphor. So if you moved to Massachusetts and your partner was from California, no, the other way. If your partner's from California and you're from Massachusetts and you move in with them in California and all of a sudden there's a huge earthquake, your partner's going to be sitting there going, no big deal, this is a Tuesday.
Sipping their coffee.
Yeah, sipping their coffee. It's a Tuesday. Don't
You're
stress.
Freaking out underneath the table in the in the bunker.
or you jump into the tub.
Yeah.
Or whatever you're supposed to do with earthquakes. I don't even know because I'm from Massachusetts.
We're not trained on it.
Yeah, we're not trained on it. It's like when down south, Emilia's family, they have a place in South Carolina, and it snowed down in South Carolina, and it was funny for them because they grew up in New England.
Right.
And they said everyone was losing their minds.
Yeah, it's
whereas
like my client
for us,
in Texas
who's
from Rhode Island, and it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like people are freaking out, and
they're not prepared. They're
1
not
centimeter
used
of
to
snow.
it. They're not used to it, right? So that's exactly what the Richter scale is in New England, we're used to big snowstorms, so it's not that big a deal. Everything's going to be fine.
Well,
Stop
you
freaking out.
develop systems to be able to handle that and manage that because it's your normal.
Snow plows, all the stuff.
Salting, icing, or
all of it.
Salt, sand, all that jazz. Also icing. If you don't like your neighbors.
Now you know how we handle our snowstorms. We throw a little ice on our neighbor's porch. I'm kidding. We don't. This is fun. Okay, so growing up, I had a stepfather from age 3 to 14, and my mom and stepfather did not get along. And that is a very polite way to put it. They fought. And let's just say my Richter scale growing up was, whoa. And so what's normal for me is not normal for Emilia, because growing up, Emilia's parents, mom and dad, made a conscious choice to never fight in front of the children. And so Emilia growing up didn't see her parents fighting. Mm-hmm. And then she went over to a friend's place and saw probably a heated battle and was like, what in the actual fuck is going on here?
Yeah.
Whereas if I noticed that from a friend's place, it would be like, oh, this is a Tuesday. Mm-hmm. So depending on how you grew up, your normal is not normal necessarily for your partner. Now, sometimes it is. My first partner, her name was Alyssa, and she grew up in an environment where her parents fought a lot too. Mm-hmm. And so we both were trauma bonded in some ways. And she was not surprised whenever there was an increase in Richter scale-ness. So when Alyssa and I had her parents or my family an earthquake, so to speak, she wasn't super miffed by it. It was kind of her normal. Mm-hmm. Whereas I've taken Emilia to a few gatherings that got out of hand. And let's just say there was an earthquake. And for Emilia, it was a very different experience than it was for me, because it was way beyond her Richter scale. One more story. Emilia one time said, Alan, I just witnessed you be made fun of by your friends and family and then join them in making fun of you. Yeah. And I said, sweetheart, that wasn't even bad. That was totally normal. So your normal is not normal, and there's implications to that. And I've since really changed my Richter scale quite a bit, thanks to you, my love. So
absolutely. Well, a couple things that I'll add and kind of round out the context. So when it comes to the Richter scales as it pertains to our listeners, the big question here is, what does a Richter scale contain? So obviously through the stories that you shared, it's around ultimately treatment of one another, treatment of other human beings. And you grew up in a household that didn't treat other human beings with kindness, with respect, with dignity, and with nonviolent communication, right? So there was yelling and screaming and fighting. There was
definitely
swears being thrown around.
Always.
There was criticism and threats and
character
assassinations. There was an increase of violence in the amplitude and tonality of the voice, so screaming and yelling and loud. There was also proximity in terms of physical leaning in and threats to help keep and remain subservient and compliant as a child, right? And so all of those different levels of emotional, social, physical factors of intimidation and compliance and control, that is essentially what represents the Richter scale. And that is what you referred to. And for all of our listeners, it's helpful to understand the spectrum of Richter scales and how what we grew up in our childhood, it sets the tone for what you think is normal level of treatment, aka the standard of treatment that you're going to tolerate. So my household, because of that conscious decision of my parents, and mind you, the context of why that got set up in the first place was because my grandfather had a wild Richter scale, was very verbally abusive from my understanding, and physically abusive as well. And so that they didn't want to continue to bring into the household, and knew that it wasn't good for a child. So there was not screaming, there was not fighting, there was not word choice that was swears, slander, character assassinations. There was absolutely no even slamming of doors, no throwing things, no physical violence. The treatment that I grew up in terms of the standard of how we would treat one another was very, very high. And at times that felt really cagey. But if I were to see other households, I would have so much respect and appreciation for that because of the fact
What do
that,
you mean by cagey?
So like when you have the higher standard of treatment, it feels cagey to always speak when you're really angry or when you're really frustrated at like a sibling or at your parents and you just want to throw some curse words. It feels really cagey to not be able to express your anger and sadness and frustration, those low valence type emotions when you feel hurt or wronged by someone within your family. It feels really cagey, almost like you're not able to fully express yourself because you can't get out some of that aggression towards someone. But because that standard was so high in the household that I grew up in, I'm really grateful because of the fact that we have no concept about how what we say and what we do with other people, how that really does hurt people, how it introduces limiting beliefs, and how that sets the tone for what essentially we accept and tolerate in the future relationships that we have.
I have a new client, anonymous always, and she grew up with an alcoholic who, she has a very different Richter scale than her husband, and because of how she grew up. That's what we're talking about here. Another good example, and again, we'll just say this as a concept. If you grew up in an environment where you were beaten, you're going to tolerate a lot more than someone who is used to being treated with respect and kindness.
Right.
And a lot of times, there's pros and cons to both ends. I'll go brief with this. But one thing that I've found is that a lot of people who do get brought up in a very soft, a very kind environment, they usually struggle, not always, but sometimes they struggle with entitlement.
Yeah.
And they don't appreciate the simplest things in life. Whereas someone who did grow up abused, a lot of times they are so grateful to even have love at all.
Right.
And so they're not entitled to love. So there's pros and cons to both of these, but when it comes to the context of your intimate relationship, the Conscious Couples podcast exists for one reason and one reason only. And it's to improve your intimate relationship, to help you flourish in your intimate relationship. So Emilia and I, we actually did a ChatGPT research before this, and there was 20 common ways in which people mistreat their spouse. And we're not going to spat all 20 of them out, although we will. Stay tuned for future episodes because we're going to unpack some of this stuff. But essentially, what is your Richter scale and what is your partner's Richter scale and what are the implications of that? And so I grew up in an environment where an earthquake isn't going to rattle me, but it will rattle Emilia. So she's been able to really help me understand how poorly I've been treated, not only by friends, but also by other people in my life. And it's helped me realize, like, oh, yeah, I guess I am being mistreated there. So maybe I need to set a boundary or say that that's not okay. And that's still very foreign to me because it's not, I mean, why am I entitled to be treated a certain way? I don't know. I don't know how much I understand that fully, but.
Right. Well, one of the things that's important from my perspective in this dialogue, specifically for this episode, is we tolerate, or we get what we tolerate, right? That's such a through line when it comes to how people treat us. And there's a thing that's called repetition compulsion, which is when you have a Richter scale, let's say you grew up with an alcoholic, right? As a family member or as a, let's just say, parent. More often than not, your central nervous system, because it's assimilated and habitualized to that being your normal, that being violent character assassinations, your parents going from, warm and loving to the next thing when they're drunk, aggressive and abusive. And that becomes your normal. So your central nervous system starts to seek that out in other people. So you being mistreated and mishandled, for lack of better words, by other type of relationship, you're unconsciously going to seek that out to repeat those patterns because patterns are familiar.
Comfort zone, familiar.
Exactly. So what does that mean?
How does someone break that pattern? Well, how does someone go about breaking that?
A lot of people actually avoid the truth that what you grew up in sets the tone of so much of your life and your neural chemistry, your wiring, etc. And so anyone who doesn't acknowledge and accept that as a scientific fact will have a difficult time breaking any sort of cycle like that.
And so what is it that they're struggling to accept in a
nutshell?
Yeah.
It's the fact that the way in which they were raised is how they are going to navigate their life. Unless, of course, they accept the downside of how they were raised.
What's going on? This is Brandon and Hannah. We wanted to give a shout out to Alan and Emilia and their relationship talks. And going into relationship talks, I was under the impression that, my relationship didn't have any conflict or didn't have any problems. And it seemed, it actually was that way, but I knew I wanted a relationship that resembled Alan and Emilia, and that's a relationship that is just next level and different from other relationships. So seeking out their help has really brought me and Hannah together, and it's just been really, really incredible, and I can't thank them enough.
Yeah, Alan and Emilia have both helped us in recognizing and acknowledging each other's really important core values and given us insight and guidance on how to align those together so that we know we're growing together and never apart. The goal is always to kind of be in everything together as a team.
Alan and Emilia, we love you and thank you so much for everything you do.
Thank you.
So I'm going to share a story. Emilia and I have a place that we used to get sushi at all the time. And there's a package store next to it where you go get liquor. And Emilia had gone in, I forget why, but I sat there and I was outside the Packy store.
Did I go in the liquor store?
No, you didn't go in the liquor store.
Sushi.
No,
Okay.
you went to the sushi place.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I actually asked you afterwards to not park there.
Right.
Yeah, you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
So, and the reason why is because I watched this drunk driving father with a little girl in his hands, little blonde girl, and I watched him stumble into the liquor store, come out with his daughter, so drive drunk with his daughter, pick his daughter up, bring her into the liquor store, buy liquor while already stumbling drunk, and then come out with a brown bag, and I could see the little girl loves her dad.
Yeah.
And just, that's her fucking hero.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw her future, and I was just, oh no, if that's your fucking hero,
right,
what are you going to tolerate in your life? So,
well, I want to unpack that, because what you mean by that is that little girl, the probability of her growing up and seeking out a drunk as her partner
is very high.
Extraordinarily high.
Well, real quick, so if she unconsciously thinks her dad is amazing because he's her hero, that's her standard for men unconsciously. And that has huge implications for who she ends up with in the future.
Not just her standard for men, but her standard for how men treat her.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, she will, in my opinion, he's a shitty father.
Yeah.
And shouldn't be driving drunk with his kid. And essentially, if she doesn't grow up and realize how shitty her dad was,
which is exactly
which is very hard to do because she probably loves him,
right?
Then she's going to basically almost automatically set a low standard for who she tolerates. And this is why leading by example is everything. And this is why when Emilia and I do have children, and when we do, we intend on also starting the Conscious Parenting podcast, which I'm very excited for. But ultimately, we're already talking about often how we want to lead by example for our children. There
literally
are things
taking care of things now, so that we already have momentum underneath our belt when we have children.
Well, that's exactly it. Is how do we set an example for our kids of what is a great relationship and how to cultivate that and sustain that over time. And I've been in this industry for 10 years now, the self-improvement space. And my very first company was called Alan Lazarus LLC, what you'll never learn in school but desperately need to know. And desperately was in all caps. And I came in as this sort of naive, I'm going to bring personal development to the masses and to the school system, and I'm going to help people improve themselves, and I'm going to change the world. And I'm still doing that in many regards. But I think that I used to believe that people cared about being better people.
And treating each other better.
And I do think that some people do, of course, right? Some people really are putting a sincere effort into being a better person every day.
Mm-hmm.
But that's actually very, very alarmingly less common than I had hoped. And of course, that's the growth journey. So if you're out there, please lead by example. We're here to lead leaders. And if your relationship sucks, you got to work on yourself and you got to work on it. And you can do that. And we're going to do an episode at some point where we unpack those 20 things, the 20 ways that spouses tend to mistreat each other. And we're going to have an analysis of, let's assess your relationship, green, yellow, red. And I guarantee you out of that list of 20, there's probably a couple yellows in there for me with you.
Same.
And vice versa that we can work on. And so let's stop pretending that we don't have inadequacies, and let's face some of the realities of our past and our present so that we can have a bigger, better, brighter future. Because the truth is, the first step to getting better is admitting that you're kind of sucking.
That's exactly what what I was trying to say with, like, how does someone break that? It's like you first have to acknowledge, and that story with that little girl is you essentially saying, like, you have to de-pedestal, take the good, yes, which is what people normally do when we look back at our family of origin and our family history and everything, specifically our parents who set the groundwork of what we believe treatment is and what it should be. But, like, yes, okay, they can be your hero, but also understand that they just got that pedestal because they're your father or they're your mom. Like, they're also a person who has flaws, who is imperfect, who hasn't worked on themselves.
Can you define a pedestal? What do you mean by
a pedestal? The best thing that comes to mind is the Olympic athletes, right? So picture Simone Biles. We just watched an amazing documentary series about her.
She's the world's current greatest gymnast, potentially greatest gymnast in history thus far. She won Olympic gold medal. So imagine her. Yes. So imagine her winning an Olympic gold medal. The pedestal is the first, second, and third place on the Olympics. That would be a pedestal.
So she's the one that's standing on the pedestal, right? Yep. So, but here's the thing with our parents, they just inherently have gotten that pedestal because of how we are young, we're naive, we don't know our parents as people. We just come into this world and they're the person that are quote unquote meeting our needs. So they get that pedestal unconsciously in our minds. And then we never go back and look and reassess of where we came from, those Richter scales, how those got implemented. And more importantly, from my perspective, how those never got reevaluated, the Richter scales of how we treat one another, what the values, what the core beliefs, what the epigenetic trauma that they've continued to perpetuate in our family systems. Like, that's never really been reevaluated. So a lot of people in relationships won't go back and accept the not so pleasant stuff about their family history and acknowledge how that's impacted their decision making, and specifically how that's impacted the way in which they show up and treat one another in relationships. And I believe it's because of that lack of depedestaling, the inability to know how to do that in a way that's safe, that still allows that love and that care for your parental figure, your whoever that guidance figure was. I do think that makes it astronomically, honestly, difficult when it comes to really changing those Richter scales, recognizing where you might be off as a partner, and then how you might be contributing to a net negative in your relationship when it comes to treatment.
Well, you and I have the burn book, and we did this for a short time where we would pick pictures from our past and share them with each other, and we can't even, it's so weird for us to realize what we tolerated from ourselves and other people. This comes down to standards.
Self-worth.
I had such low fucking standards for who I allowed into my life, and that was really detrimental. And it makes sense if you don't ever reassess. Oh, okay. So, and I'm going to use one of my clients anonymously as an example. I just talked to her. Her father was an alcoholic, and he was her hero, similar to that girl outside the Packy with the father going into the liquor store.
Mm-hmm.
And she, as an adult, is currently reassessing, oh, so he's actually kind of a loser.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually doesn't work very hard. And he's actually, he's funny, but he's kind of dumb.
Mm.
And I know that sounds really mean, but the truth will set you free. So now she has the opportunity to reassess her life from an accurate frame. And now she can set a new standard for herself and for her husband, and then they can set a new standard as parents, and that can change generationally the whole world over time. Again,
absolutely. And my parents are a great example of that.
Exactly, they're breaking the cycle, and they said, you know what? Okay, what we saw growing up is not okay, and we're going to do it different.
Yeah.
And
Which
that's
has
what you and
allowed me to bring that into us.
Exactly.
And us to bring that to our future children, which is like so amazing.
Beautiful.
You know, I think it's wonderful.
So if you're out there watching or listening to this, set a higher fucking standard. No,
Easier said than done.
Yeah, exactly.
We know that.
No,
There's
but
skills.
But seriously, I'm being playful, but also I'm serious. Let's set a higher standard for ourselves and others, but start with yourself, because how dare anyone ask you to do something that they're not doing? The leading by example to me is absolutely everything. Is there anything you want to add before we go?
The only thing is, while that might be easier for someone with self-belief to say, someone who might not believe in their ability to set a higher standard, that's where humility can be your greatest strength. We both know people who maybe didn't have the skill or didn't have the self-belief to be able to do so. Like, okay, Alan, like, what does that even look like? What does that even mean? How do I even do that? You might not know how to do that. That's okay. But your superpower will be humility. And you and I both know people who have humility and work ethic and have so deeply raised their standard as a result of them turning towards us and saying, hey, I don't know how to do this. I want to set a higher standard. I just don't know how. I was never given the skills. I was never taught the skills, but I have the humility and work ethic to learn whatever you guys have to share with us. And they've put that into practice. And you and I both know those people have like blown it out of the water in terms of what they now allow into their life in terms of treatment of others. So I'm really proud of those individuals. And I want to extend that to anyone that might be listening to this episode and or your partner that you send this episode to. If they have humility and they have the ability to have work ethic, that pointed in our direction can certainly help them with that tremendously.
Yeah, and if anyone is out there listening or watching this and you struggle to believe in yourself, if you have the humility to reach out, we will help you. I mean, we are helping dozens, hundreds. My company, we track this every single day. We just surpassed 1.17 million listens across this podcast, Next Level University, and Podcast Growth University. So we're helping people. It's doable. Mm-hmm. And there are people that are proving that it's doable. So if you're struggling to believe in yourself, we will help you so much if you have humility.
Yes.
Big if.
Big if.
So reach out to us if you want to do relationship talks coaching. And if you're struggling and you admit, okay, I want to get better. Great. I need to get better. Great. If you're struggling with self-belief, reach out. Relationship talks coaching will help tremendously.
The last invite that we have, the link in the show notes, is getting on the same page about growth. And so this is our Relationship Talks event that we host every single month. You might have heard about it in the past, but if you haven't, we invite you to this. It's a free live virtual event that we host the third Thursday of every single month. It's at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be hosting it February 20th. So be there, be square. Ultimately, it's around what we found in the last 40 plus events is that the conscious couples community, there's usually one partner that's far more growth oriented and the other one might not be at the same place, and that's okay. However, what that creates is what's called a growth gap. And this event is designed to help you two grow together and not apart as a result of that growth gap. One of the biggest struggles that we've seen in the conscious community is how do you close that gap? And how do you be okay with the fact that that gap might not be closing as fast as I need it to, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about in this event.
When Emilia and I first got together, there was a growth gap for us. I was ahead in fitness. She was ahead in the inner work. I got a therapist and I caught up on the inner work. She has been with me in the gym now for
whooping his ass.
For 1,078 days in a row, Emilia and I. And together. Isn't that crazy? It's wild.
So grateful.
The gap is we're growing together, not apart. Whereas when I first met you, if you hadn't come up in fitness and I hadn't come up in the inner work, it would be much harder for us to coexist and build a future together and be the parents that we want to be and be the partners we want to be. So if there's a growth gap, there probably is. Let's address that now rather than have it break you up later. Okay, we got to get out of here. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, it's not about you or me. It's about the we. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Conscious Couples podcast. We love connecting with the Conscious Couples community, so please make sure you follow us on Instagram. I am at Evolve with Emilia and Alan is A_Lazarus88.
Also, if you or your partner resonated with this episode, leave us a review at the link in the show notes, and please share this with someone you love and care about.
Until next time, remember, it's not about you or me. It's about
the we.